I'm going to present a joint work with Maya Datan, Kai Wachin, Aviv Zohar, and Arthur Gervais. I'm Aviv Yaish. In this work, we explore the optimal and suboptimal use of three core decentralized finance primitives. The first is collateralized lending, so platforms such as Compound and AAV let people deposit funds and accrue interest, or borrow funds and pay interest. The second primitive is flash swaps. So I assume that people here know what swaps are and what flash loans are. Flash swaps are essentially the love child of these two primitives. They let people take out one asset, use it for the duration of a transaction, given that they would repay it plus maybe some fees by the end of the transaction. And the last primitive is flash swap-based liquidations. So some lending platforms allow people to liquidate unhealthy debt positions, and some liquidation tools, some liquidators use flash swaps for that purpose, so that people that do not have the upfront capital to liquidate a position could still perform liquidations. So for each one of these primitives, we cast its optimal one-shot execution as an optimization problem, which we then use to evaluate the suboptimality of users who use these primitives in practice. With respect to lenders, people who interact with lending pools, we show that in some cases they could have improved their profits by over 100%. With respect to arbitrageurs that use flash swaps to close arbitrage opportunities due to price discrepancies between exchanges, we show that a lower bound on their lost profits is $4 million, which is not a lot, but we use our data to uncover other surprising facts. For example, we present circumstantial evidence showing that some private transaction relays use the private order flow that's sent through them. So these are not the relays you know from PBS. These are services that let people send transactions in private to block builders, proposers, etc., without going through the public mempool. Some of these services don't ask for any compensation in return for their services. Also, some of them promise users that they would not use the information that they are exposed to in any form. Okay? This has caused some people in the community to ask themselves, well, these services are costly to operate. Why are these people operating these services, right? Like Ty Cobb fan here asked. So I know that Phil Dayan is here somewhere. I don't know why I put your tweet, okay? No idea. Our evidence are for a different relay, okay? I'll explain everything in depth soon. So let's start with the first primitive, lending pools. To set their interest rates for both lenders and borrowers, lending pools such as Compound and Aviv use a metric they call the utilization. It's a fraction which is defined as the amount of funds borrowed out over the amount of funds deposited in a pool. Okay? Interest rates are monotonically increasing in the utilization. And this gives us some nice properties. For example, when the utilization is close to 1, when most of our funds are borrowed out, these rate mechanisms would increase the interest rates. And intuitively, this incentivizes borrowers to repay their loans, and also incentivizes new users to provide funds to the liquidity pool because the interest rates are high. And when the utilization is close to 0, it means that our money is just lying around and not making profits for us. We want people to take out loans and pay us interest. So it's good for us to set the interest rates to be low to incentivize people to take out loans. When taking the perspective of a liquidity provider, of a person that has some funds lying around and who may want to deposit them in a liquidity pool, We cast the decision of whether to deposit funds, and if so, how much, as an optimization problem. And we show that counterintuitively, in some cases, users would not find it optimal to deposit all of their funds in a single pool. That is because by doing so, they actually lower their absolute profits. Okay? When taking the perspective of a user that already has some funds in the pool, this means that sometimes it's optimal to withdraw some of the funds because this causes the user to earn more profits on this lower amount of money. Okay? This is very important for everyone here to understand. You can earn more on smaller deposits. That's surprising, at least to me. So when we wrote this paper, we took a recent example. We saw that Aviv's curve pool had 80% of its funds provided by a single user. That user could have withdrawn 28% of its funds to increase its profits by a factor of 7. Okay? Short-term profits, at least. This does not consider the impact of the withdrawal on other users. Okay? So it's reasonable to think that if a user withdraws a large amount of money, this increases the interest rates, probably causing other people to want to deposit their own funds into the pool, right? But when considering thinly traded assets, this logic does not hold because other people don't have enough funds to repay what was withdrawn. And about 1 month after we put this paper online, the very same user from Aviv's curve pool have provided an example of why this works in the long run for thinly traded assets. So that user started employing a strategy similar to our own and succeeded in jacking up the interest rates and its absolute profits for over 1 week. Okay? Although our optimization problem is for a one-shot setting, it succeeded in increasing profits for a longer time. Great, so in the paper we have more results for lending pools. Let's continue with the second primitive, flash swaps. So exchanges like Uniswap and all of its derivatives let people swap one asset for another. Under the hood, they implement all swaps as flash swaps. Okay, so first users receive some asset, they can use it for the duration of a transaction, given that they repay the asset plus maybe some fees at the end. This is commonly used by arbitrageurs, people who seek profit opportunities that can be made by exploiting exchange rate discrepancies between exchanges. Specifically, it's commonly used because it allows users to not have the upfront capital which is needed to close these arbitrage opportunities. So when writing this paper, I actually just randomly sampled blocks and transactions, and I noticed a peculiar pattern of sequences of consecutive transactions which exploit roughly the same arbitrage. So for example, maybe they close arbitrage opportunity between Uniswap version 2 and version 3 between USDC and ETH, and the transaction immediately after it does the same, but between Uniswap version 3 and SushiSwap, and etc. for other transactions in the sequence. This shows that the first transaction in the sequence is actually suboptimal, because if all transactions use flash swaps, it means that no one needed any upfront capital to succeed. Meaning that the first transaction could have done whatever all the latter transactions did and earned their profits. So when applying this heuristic on the data for the 2 years before we wrote this paper, we estimate the amount of money left on the floor by arbitrageurs by at least $4 million. Okay. So this suboptimality is very reasonable, right? Arbitrageurs have a huge state space to traverse in a very short amount of time, in 12 seconds, right now in Ethereum. Obviously, they cannot fully traverse it. So that's one reason we give for suboptimality. Another is that arbitrageurs actually have an incentive not to fully exploit arbitrage opportunities, because if they would fully exploit them, they would increase the risk of their transactions not working when in an actual block. Okay, so they have an incentive to make their transactions slightly suboptimal, or maybe even very suboptimal, to increase their chances of succeeding on-chain. So given the data that we collected, we also uncover another surprising result. As I said at the beginning of the talk, some services let users submit transactions in private without going through the public mempool. They're called private transaction relays, and specifically Ethermine, the largest miner in Ethereum before the merge, operated one such relay. And they promised to never leak nor act on the information they receive via the relay. So we asked, is that so? In our data, we found that one specific arbitrageur only has transactions in blocks created by Ethermine. That arbitrageur started operating roughly the same time when Ethermine opened their relay, also closed at roughly the same time, and also had transactions that appear in suboptimal transaction sequences, specifically after transactions that do not seem to have appeared in the public mempool. Okay, so private transactions. This is circumstantial evidence that Ethermine either operated this arbitrageur or maybe shared some of its private information with the arbitrageur. Great. So our last primitive is flash swap based liquidations. So as I said, some lending pools let users liquidate unhealthy debt positions. Okay? This means that users repay some of the borrowed funds to receive some of the collateral, the corresponding collateral at a discount. For the same reason as I mentioned earlier for arbitrageurs, flash swaps come in handy here for liquidators that don't have the necessary upfront capital. We again cast the execution of this primitive as an optimization problem, and we also solve it giving a closed form solution. And using this solution, we show that in certain cases, liquidators would not find it optimal to fully liquidate unhealthy debt positions up to the allowed amount by the protocol. Okay? Instead, it's optimal to liquidate a smaller fraction than that. And the intuition behind this is that when using a flash swap for a large debt position, the size of the swap can impact the exchange rate between the collateral asset and the borrowed asset. And this impact can be so large that it causes the liquidation to be less profitable than if the liquidator would have liquidated a smaller amount of the debt. So just in case people are not fully familiar with the technicalities of liquidations, let's say that the exchange rate between ETH and USDC is 2,000 USDC for 1 ETH, and that we have a borrower that wants to take out a loan of 1 ETH. Lending pools commonly require borrowers to over-collateralize their loan. So let's say that the collateral required for this position is 2,400 USDC. Okay, this is a 20% over-collateralization. And let's say that now the exchange rate between these two assets has changed a little. Now, to buy 1 ETH, we need 22,000 USDC. Okay? This means that our borrower is not over-collateralized by 20% anymore, right? So what if some of the people who provided this 1 ETH want to cash out? We need to have enough money to allow them to cash out. To do that, lending pools let liquidators repay the debt, right, the 1 ETH, in exchange for the collateral. So for paying 1 ETH, our liquidator here would get 2,400 USDC, which represents a discount compared to the current exchange rate, right? So this is a bargain, supposedly. But if the liquidator does not have the necessary upfront capital, the 1 ETH, that liquidator would need to use either a flash loan or flash swap. So in that case, if the flash swap is performed against an exchange that uses a constant product automated market maker, for a large amount of USDC or whatever that liquidator requires, the exchange rate between USDC and ETH may be impacted along the lines I said earlier, right? Meaning that for very large positions, the impact may cause the profitability of the liquidator to go down. So it's better to perform a smaller swap to make sure this doesn't happen. So these are our main results. We have many other results in the paper. To conclude, we examine 3 core primitives. We show that some users use them suboptimally. To do so, we cast each as an optimization problem. And besides these results, we also raise a lot of interesting follow-up questions. Specifically, if users were to act optimally, they may harm the stability and health of the corresponding protocol. For example, if we look at liquidations, right, the optimal behavior may be to liquidate a small fraction of the unhealthy debt. Obviously, we would want users to fully liquidate unhealthy debt, at least up until the limit imposed by the protocol. So this means that the optimal behavior may harm the stability of the mechanism. So an immediate question is, can we design good protocols that actually incentivize the type of behavior we want to see? And actually, this is much harder than it seems, because sometimes when examining a protocol in isolation, it may seem good. But here, the difficulty arises when looking at the bigger picture, when examining not the specific protocol in isolation, but when thinking of how users actually use it, and the fact that they use it together with other protocols. This is what causes the bad outcome that maybe we can avoid with different mechanisms. So that's it. Do you have any questions?
Thank you so much, Aviv. Do we have any questions? Maybe I can start one while you're thinking. So you mentioned earlier that that arbitrageurs might be incentivized to not fully exploit arbitrage opportunities and instead only partially exploit them. Could you explain that a little bit more? Why is that the case? And do we have a sense for how strongly that effect holds?
So it really depends. You can think of a hard-coded arbitrage transaction that is optimal, right? Its success depends on its location in the block, right? Consider that perhaps a transaction would be put in an earlier position in the block such that the exchange rates between the assets that are exploited, whatever, changes, right? This would probably cause the arbitrage transaction to fail. So you have an incentive to kind of tone it down, not be fully optimal.
Okay, thank you. Please go ahead.
Hi, so when designing better mechanisms, I think like the main obstacle, in addition to the platform being isolated, this is also like an inherent blockchain problem of partial information, because the only information you have is up to the end of the previous block, right? So even if you have platforms that somehow collaborate and you have some global design, then it still wouldn't suffice because the state wouldn't be updated otherwise until the block ends, right?
So I didn't completely understand the question.
Like, okay, so you only, like, the state is updated when the previous block ends, and now you're updating the new state. And the platform now, even if it has access to non-local information from other platforms, still has only partial information with regards to transactions that occurred in this block that is being created right now, right? So even if you design some global, more global system cross-platform, that still wouldn't solve the inherent problem of relying only on partial information.
Yeah, definitely, that's true.
I don't have much experience with arbitrage, so I apologize if it's a stupid question. But you had an example in part 3 that mentions like someone used 120% of collateral to do that. So like, what's the rationale behind that? Like why would I put 120% of the worth of the collateral to do that? What was the rationale behind that?
So that was not an example of arbitrage. That was an example of a user that wanted to borrow some funds. Okay, this over-collateralization is required by the platform to protect against exchange rate shocks. Right? We want to have an equivalent amount of the borrowed funds stored with us to pay our lenders. And the rationale for people to take such, like to borrow from collateralized lending pools is, for example, it's an equivalent of doing a short, right? You take one asset, you pay with another. If the collateral asset drops in value, then you made money,
Okay.
right?
I see. Thanks.
If there are no other questions, let's please thank Aviv.